In 1847, a married woman in Edinburgh spent 3 hours every day reading poetry to a man dying of consumption in her husband's clinic, while her husband watched from the doorway and did nothing to stop it. This wasn't an affair. It wasn't even unusual. In the private tuberculosis sanatoriums of Victorian Britain, wives of physicians routinely provided intimate daily care to male patients, feeding them, bathing them, sitting beside their beds through fevered nights. They held dying men's hands. They heard their confessions. They were present for their last words. Medical journals from the period praised this arrangement as proper feminine duty and essential to the moral treatment of consumptive patients. The Edinburgh Medical Society formally recommended that physicians' wives attend personally to the comfort and spiritual well-being of male patients in advanced stages of disease. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how Victorian medicine created a system where the boundaries between healing, intimacy, and emotional attachment became so blurred that no one could tell where one ended and another began, and how one case in Edinburgh revealed the human cost of that confusion. Here's what makes this matter. We want to believe that professional boundaries, emotional restraint, and social propriety protect us from complicated feelings. That marriage vows, medical ethics, and Victorian morality would keep people from forming attachments across the barrier between life and death. But what happens when the very system designed to maintain those boundaries requires their constant violation? When duty demands intimacy and healing requires emotional connection so profound that distinguishing it from love becomes impossible. This is about something deeper than scandal or forbidden romance. It's about what happens to the human heart when we're asked to care deeply while feeling nothing. When proximity to death strips away social performance and reveals the raw need for connection. When the same culture that demands emotional labour refuses to acknowledge the emotions that labour creates. It's 9:47 on a Tuesday night in April 1847. You're standing in the narrow hallway of your husband's private clinic on Frederick Street in Edinburgh's new town. Through the half-open door ahead, you can hear the wet, rattling cough that's become as familiar as your own breathing. The hallway smells of carbolic soap and the coal smoke that drifts in from the street. Your dress, heavy black wool, appropriate for afternoon calls, brushes against the wallpaper as you pause outside the room. In your hands, a leather-bound volume of Wordsworth's collected poems, the pages already soft from handling, certain passages marked with small pencil dots only you would notice. You're 28 years old. You've been married for 6 years to Dr. James Thornton, one of Edinburgh's most respected specialists in diseases of the chest. This building, 4 floors of converted townhouse, is both his clinic and your home. The patients on the 2nd floor are his, the drawing room on the 3rd floor is yours. But this particular patient in this particular room has somehow become something that belongs to neither category. His name is William Ashford. He's 32 years old, a scholar of medieval manuscripts at the university, unmarried. He's been under your husband's care for 8 months, boarding in this room, because his lodgings near the college were too cold, too damp, too far from medical supervision. He's been dying for 6 of those months, the tuberculosis too advanced when he finally sought treatment, the characteristic cavity in his right lung already formed. You push the door open. He's sitting up in bed, propped on pillows, a book open on his lap. The afternoon light through the window makes his face look even more translucent than usual. You can see the blue veins at his temples, the way his skin has become so thin it seems to barely contain him. He looks up when you enter, and his whole face changes, not dramatically, just a subtle softening around the eyes, a easing of the tension in his jaw. The same expression you've learned to recognize over the past 3 months since this reading ritual began. The same expression that makes your chest feel too tight, makes you aware of your own heartbeat in a way that has nothing to do with exertion. "Mrs. Thornton," he says. His voice is weak today. That's what you notice first, always. The variations in strength that tell you whether today is better or worse, whether he slept, whether the night sweats were bad. You don't yet know that within 4 weeks he'll be dead. You don't know that his last words will be spoken to you, not your husband. You don't know that 40 years later, as an elderly widow, you'll still be able to recite entire poems from memory because you read them aloud so many times in this room, your voice the soundtrack to his dying. You don't know that you're about to become the centre of a scandal that will force the Edinburgh Medical Society to rewrite their guidelines on appropriate care. That letters discussing your case will be preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, debated by medical ethicists, cited in discussions about professional boundaries well into the 20th century. All you know right now is that you're here, again, because this has become the axis around which your days turn, and that somewhere behind you, in the hallway, your husband is watching. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what Edinburgh was in 1847, the medical capital of the English-speaking world, the city where modern clinical medicine was being invented, where physicians were learning to diagnose disease through physical examination rather than just asking patients about symptoms. Dr. James Thornton had trained under the great chest disease specialists of the Edinburgh School. He'd learned to percuss, to tap on, a patient's chest and interpret the sounds to map the cavities and fluid in diseased lungs. He'd learned to auscultate, to press his ear against a dying man's rib cage and listen to the wet crackle of tubercular destruction. This was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, doctors could diagnose tuberculosis with certainty while patients were still alive. But this certainty came with a terrible price. They could tell you exactly how you would die, but they couldn't stop it. Tuberculosis, consumption as it was called then, killed 1 in 4 people in Victorian Britain. It killed slowly over months or years, destroying the lungs from within. Victims coughed blood, lost weight until they were skeletal, burned with fever, drowned gradually in the fluid their own bodies produced. And there was no cure. Bleeding, blistering, opium for pain, fresh air, rest. That was all medicine could offer. But Edinburgh's medical elite believed in something else, moral treatment, the idea that a patient's spiritual and emotional state affected their physical decline. That companionship, intellectual stimulation, and gentle emotional support could ease suffering even if they couldn't prevent death. This is where physicians' wives entered the system. According to medical texts published in the 1840s, preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, doctors' wives were considered uniquely suited to provide moral treatment to male patients. They had the education to engage patients in elevated conversation, the social status to command respect, the feminine delicacy to provide comfort without impropriety. And, this part was stated explicitly, they were safely married, which meant their care carried no romantic implications. The Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal published an article in 1845 recommending that the wives of physicians attending consumptive patients in private sanatoriums should make daily visits to provide reading, conversation, and spiritual comfort, particularly to unmarried male patients who lack family care. Margaret Thornton, her name preserved in the case records that would later be unsealed, was following medical advice when she first entered William Ashford's room. He'd been admitted in September 1846. A university colleague of his, worried about his deteriorating health, had referred him to Dr. Thornton's clinic. The initial consultation notes, archived at the Royal College of Physicians, describe him as a gentleman of scholarly disposition, unmarried, showing advanced signs of phthisis with hemoptysis and marked cachexia. Translation: he was coughing blood and wasting away. Dr. Thornton recommended immediate residency at the clinic. Ashford's rooms at the university were unsuitable, cold, damp, poorly ventilated. The walk to and from a doctor's office was too strenuous for his weakened state. Private nursing care was expensive, and he had no family in Edinburgh to provide it. So he moved into the room on the second floor. Dr. Thornton examined him twice daily. A housekeeper brought meals, and Margaret Thornton, as was expected of a physician's wife, began making morning visits to inquire about his comfort and needs. At first, these visits were brief, 5 minutes, perhaps 10, purely functional. Did he need additional blankets? Was the fire adequate? Should they send for any particular foods he might tolerate? But Ashford was a scholar. His room filled up with books, not the devotional literature typically recommended for dying patients, but medieval manuscripts he was attempting to catalogue before he became too weak. Illuminated texts in Latin, histories of monasteries, studies of medieval medicine, including treatises on consumption written by physicians who'd been just as helpless as Dr. Thornton. Margaret had been educated, as daughters of Edinburgh's professional class were. She'd studied languages, literature, history. She'd had tutors, a small private library, expectations of cultured conversation that marriage to a busy physician had largely unfulfilled. The visits grew longer. By December, she was spending an hour each afternoon reading aloud while Ashford worked on his manuscripts. He was too weak now to hold books for extended periods. His hands trembled. The concentration required for reading made him cough. By January 1847, the reading sessions had extended to 2 hours, sometimes longer. She read Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, the romantic poets whose work was still considered vaguely scandalous, too emotional, too concerned with individual feeling. Ashford would listen, eyes closed, his breathing laboured but peaceful. Dr. Thornton knew, of course he knew. The clinic had 4 floors, perhaps 30 rooms, but you couldn't hide daily 2-hour visits. The housekeeper knew, the other patients knew. In a case study published years later in the British Medical Journal, a colleague who'd visited the clinic described observing Dr. Thornton standing in the hallway outside his patient's room, listening to his wife's voice reading poetry, making no motion to interrupt or intervene. This was where the system revealed its fatal flaw. Medical advice insisted that physicians' wives provide emotional care to dying patients. Social propriety insisted that this care remain bloodless, disinterested, purely dutiful. But how do you spend hours every day beside a dying man, reading him poetry, watching his face as he listens, learning to interpret every variation in his breathing without forming an attachment? How do you do emotional labour without having emotions? In February 1847, Ashford began what's called final decline. His coughing fits became more frequent and severe. He could no longer sit up without assistance. The night sweats soaked through bedclothes several times each night. Dr. Thornton noted in his medical records that his patient had at most 2 months remaining. Margaret increased her visits to 3 times daily, morning, afternoon, evening. She was present when the housekeeper changed his bedclothes. She held the basin when he coughed blood. She read to him even when he seemed too weak to listen, because she later told an interviewer, his breathing grew calmer when he heard a voice. Letters she wrote to her sister during this period, preserved in the papers of the Thornton family, donated to the National Library of Scotland in 1923, reveal her state of mind. She wrote about feeling tethered to Ashford's room, unable to focus on anything else, about lying awake at night wondering if he was sleeping, about the peculiar intimacy of watching someone die slowly, how it created a knowledge of another person that surpassed anything possible in ordinary social life. She wrote, "I know the exact sound of his breathing when he is comfortable versus when he is in pain. I can tell from the weight of his hand whether today is better or worse than yesterday. I have seen him weep, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the indignity of needing help with the most basic functions. I have heard him speak about his childhood, his regrets, the work he will never finish. Who else knows him this way? Certainly not the colleagues who visit once a week. Not the housekeeper who sees only tasks to be completed. Perhaps not even he knows himself as I have come to know him. She wrote, James watches and says nothing. Dr. Thornton's silence during this period is documented in multiple sources. Medical colleagues who visited the clinic noted his unusual tolerance of his wife's extended nursing care. The housekeeper later testified to investigators that she'd approached Dr. Thornton with concerns about the amount of time Mrs. Thornton was spending with the patient, and that he'd responded, "My wife is doing exactly what medical science recommends. Would you have her abandon a dying man?" Was he following his own medical principles? Was he paralysed by the same system that had created this situation? Was he watching his marriage dissolve, but unable to act, because intervention would require admitting that the care he'd recommended had led to emotional attachment? Or, and this is what makes this case endlessly fascinating to medical historians, did he understand that Margaret was providing something he couldn't? That medicine could diagnose and track the disease, but couldn't address the existential terror of dying young, unmarried, far from family? That the emotional connection his wife had formed with his patient was therapeutic in ways his percussion and auscultation could never be? William Ashford died on March 31st, 1847, at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. Margaret Thornton was present. Dr. Thornton was not. He was attending another patient 3 floors away. The housekeeper was present. So was a visiting physician who'd come to consult on another case and had been summoned when Ashford's breathing changed. According to the death record and witness, testimonies preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, Ashford's final moments unfolded like this. His breathing had been growing increasingly laboured throughout the morning. By noon he was barely conscious, slipping in and out of awareness. Margaret sat beside the bed, holding his hand. She wasn't reading. He was beyond hearing. She was simply present. Around 2 o'clock he seemed to rally slightly. His eyes opened. He looked directly at her. And he spoke. His last words clearly enough that both the housekeeper and the consulting physician heard them and recorded them. "Thank you for making the dying endurable." Then his breathing stopped. Margaret didn't cry. According to the witness testimony, she sat for several minutes in complete silence, still holding his hand. Then she stood, walked out of the room, and collapsed in the hallway. Dr. Thornton found her there. What happened next is documented in a letter he wrote to a colleague 2 weeks later. "I discovered my wife unconscious outside the deceased patient's room. Upon revival, she exhibited signs of profound emotional distress. She has been confined to bed since, unable or unwilling to speak. I confess to being at a loss as to how to proceed." The scandal that followed wasn't immediate. Death was too common in Victorian Edinburgh for one consumptive's passing to merit much attention. Ashford was buried. His university colleagues held a memorial. His manuscripts were sent to his family in London. But Margaret didn't recover. She remained in bed, refusing food, barely speaking. Dr. Thornton summoned physicians to examine her, looking for medical explanations, physical illness, nervous exhaustion, anything that could be diagnosed and treated. 6 weeks after Ashford's death, Margaret's sister arrived from Inverness. She found Margaret emaciated, barely responsive, clearly suffering from what we would now recognise as profound grief. And the sister made a decision that changed everything. She told people what had happened, not maliciously, not even scandalously. She simply went to family friends, to their minister, to physicians in her brother-in-law's professional circle, and said, "My sister developed an emotional attachment to her husband's patient while providing his care. Now the patient has died and she cannot recover from the loss. I'm asking for help because her husband seems incapable of acknowledging what's happened." That's when the medical community of Edinburgh had to confront what their own recommendations had created. The debates that followed are preserved in the minutes of the Edinburgh Medical Society from April through July 1847, and in private correspondence between physicians, archived at the Royal College of Physicians. The question wasn't whether Margaret Thornton had behaved improperly. Everyone agreed she had followed medical advice exactly. She had provided moral treatment, companionship, spiritual comfort, everything the medical literature recommended. The question was, why had following medical advice resulted in this outcome? One faction argued that the problem was Margaret herself, that she possessed an excessive sensibility that made her unsuited for nursing care, that any properly disciplined woman could provide intimate care to dying men without forming emotional attachments. But this position collapsed under scrutiny. Multiple physicians admitted that their own wives had reported difficulty maintaining emotional distance from patients. Some wives had refused to continue providing care because they found it too distressing. One physician anonymously described finding his wife weeping after a patient's death and realizing she developed feelings she couldn't explain or control. The real issue, opponents of the first faction argued, was that medicine had created an impossible standard: emotional labour without emotions, intimate care without intimacy, daily proximity to suffering and death while remaining untouched by either. Dr. James Hendry, a prominent Edinburgh physician, wrote in a private letter dated May 1847, "We have asked women to perform the most emotionally demanding work imaginable, to witness suffering we cannot alleviate, to provide comfort we cannot quantify, to form human connections we then dismiss as inappropriate when they deepen beyond our comfort. We have made wives into nurses, nurses into companions, companions into something for which we have no proper name, and then expressed shock when the boundaries we insisted were absolute proved to be fiction." The third faction, the one that ultimately prevailed, took a different position. The problem wasn't the women or the system. The problem was tuberculosis itself. The disease took too long to kill. Patients were conscious, articulate, capable of relationship right up until the end. The dying process created too much time, too much proximity, too much opportunity for attachment. The solution? Get patients out of physicians' homes, create separate institutions, sanatoriums where professional nurses, unmarried women with no personal connection to the treating physicians, would provide care. Put distance between domestic life and medical treatment. Stop asking wives to do work that belonged to professionals. Within 3 years, Edinburgh had its first dedicated tuberculosis sanatorium. Within a decade, the practice of treating consumptive patients in physicians' private clinics had largely ended. The guidelines were rewritten. Professional boundaries were formalised. The system changed because one woman's grief made visible what everyone had been trying to ignore: that you cannot ask people to care deeply without expecting them to feel deeply. That proximity to death doesn't make you numb, it makes you desperate to affirm life through connection. That the line between therapeutic relationship and genuine attachment isn't a wall. It's a gradient so subtle that you don't realise you've crossed it until you're looking back from the other side. Margaret Thornton eventually recovered, physically. 6 months after Ashford's death, she was able to leave her bed, resume some household duties, participate in social occasions when required. But letters from her later life, preserved in the Thornton family papers, reveal someone fundamentally altered. She wrote about feeling like she'd lived 2 completely different lives, the one before Ashford and the one after. She described the experience as having loved someone you could never acknowledge loving, having lost someone you could never admit to mourning. She had no language for what she'd experienced. Victorian society had words for widows, for bereaved mothers, for lost sweethearts. But what do you call a woman who spent 3 hours every day for months caring for a dying man who wasn't her husband, forming a bond that felt more real than her marriage, then watched him die and couldn't claim the right to grieve? She and James remained married, but by all accounts the relationship never recovered. Letters between James and his medical colleagues hint at his own guilt. His recognition that he'd created the conditions for his wife's attachment, then failed to protect her from it or acknowledge it afterward. Margaret lived until 1891, dying at age 72. Her obituary in the Edinburgh Evening News made no mention of the scandal. It described her as the devoted wife of the late Dr. James Thornton, known for her charitable work with the poor and her dedication to medical causes. But among her personal effects, discovered when her estate was settled, was a leather-bound volume of Wordsworth's collected poems. Certain passages were marked with small pencil dots. In the margin of one poem, in handwriting grown shaky with age, she'd written a single sentence. I read this to him on March 15th, 1847. He smiled. So what does this story reveal about the human heart across time? We want to believe in boundaries, professional ethics, marriage vows, social propriety, the discipline to care without feeling. We build elaborate systems, codes of conduct, professional standards, cultural expectations, designed to let us navigate situations that require emotional investment while protecting us from emotional consequence. But this story suggests those boundaries are fictions we tell ourselves, that when you place two people in sustained proximity, especially when one is dying and the other is tasked with easing that dying, something happens that our categories can't contain. Not necessarily romance, though our limited vocabulary often forces us to use that word. Something more fundamental, recognition, the seeing and being seen that happens when social performance becomes impossible, when vulnerability strips away the masks we present to the world. Victorian society solved the wrong problem. They created separate institutions, professional boundaries, rules about appropriate care, all designed to prevent. Another Margaret Thornton. But they didn't address the underlying question: what do we do with the emotional bonds that form when we care for the dying? How do we honour the intimacy that develops in the presence of mortality? How do we create space for grief that exists outside conventional categories? We still haven't answered these questions. Nurses form attachments to patients and struggle to find language for the loss when they die. Caregivers experience grief that's dismissed as less legitimate than family grief. People form profound connections in hospices, hospitals, long-term care facilities, connections that don't fit our narrow definitions of love, but feel more real than many relationships that do. Margaret Thornton spent 3 hours every day reading poetry to a dying man, and it changed her forever in ways she could never fully explain to anyone, including herself. The system failed her, not because it allowed the attachment to form, but because it refused to acknowledge the attachment once it had. She provided exactly the care medicine demanded. She did everything right, and it broke her. What would it have meant for one person, her husband, her sister, a minister, a friend, to say, "I see what happened. I see what you lost. Your grief is real, even though society says it shouldn't be"? We'll never know. Because no one said it. The archive preserves her silence. The medical records note her nervous collapse without acknowledging its cause. The family papers contain her letters, raw and honest, but they were sealed for 75 years after her death, read only by historians long after everyone involved had turned to dust. Her story matters because it reveals a truth we're still struggling with, that human connection doesn't obey the boundaries we construct, that caregiving creates bonds as powerful as any recognized relationship, that watching someone die, easing their fear, holding their hand through the final moments, these acts change you, mark you, leave you with a grief that's no less profound for lacking a proper name. 178 years later, we've built better boundaries, clearer ethics, professional guidelines that protect caregivers from exactly the situation Margaret Thornton experienced. We've learned from her story, but have we learned the right lessons? We've learned to create distance. But have we learned to acknowledge the cost of that distance? We've learned to professionalise care. But have we learned to honour the emotions that care creates? We've learned to prevent attachments. But have we learned to grieve them when they inevitably form anyway? In a room in Edinburgh in 1847, a woman read poetry to a dying man and fell into something she could never name, much less escape. The system that created that situation no longer exists. But the human needs that drove it, for comfort in suffering, for connection in isolation, for someone to bear witness to our dying, those haven't changed at all. Thank you for spending these minutes here, late at night, exploring this corner of forgotten history. If this story stirred something in you, questions about care, connection, or the complicated truth of human hearts, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that reveal the messy humanity behind historical events, the subscribe button is right there. William Ashford's last words were, "Thank you for making the dying endurable." We still don't know how to properly honour the people who take on that work, or what to do with the parts of themselves they lose in the process. Maybe that's a question worth sitting with, here in the quiet hours when pretense falls away and we can admit how desperately we all need someone to hold our hand in the dark.